As viewers of the show know, there has been a great deal of difficulty that people have had in Washington in trying to secure more funding for the war in Ukraine. There has been a great deal of resistance within, in particular, the House Republican caucus as a result of the fact that polls are now showing that not just Republicans and conservatives, but Americans in general are growing increasingly opposed to the idea of sending more and more billions of dollars to the war in Ukraine. And then one of the factors that drove the removal of Kevin McCarthy from his position as House Speaker, the first ever House Speaker to be removed, is the fact that some Republicans were angry over his constant cooperation with the Biden administration in securing more funding for Ukraine. At the same time, the United States has this massive debt and deficit and an inability to, in its view, fund social programs on which Americans depend, like Social Security, Medicare. The idea that we're going to keep sending billions of dollars to this war is something that has been increasingly rejected by the American citizenry, and therefore as a result of their representatives in Congress. They could not get through this last $25 billion yet. The first time since this war began that this idea of funding Ukraine endlessly has encountered any kind of difficulty. And as a result, just like the EU is doing in exploiting the war in Israel, the White House has decided that they are going to exploit this war as well. Here you see from the Washington Post yesterday, the headline, White House considers adding Ukraine to Israel aid package. So Israel is already asking for, and the government is already planning to provide hundreds of millions or perhaps billions of dollars more in weapons and aid, financial aid to fuel their war that they're now conducting against Gaza. And obviously, I don't know what the vote is going to be. We went over those votes last night, that every time a resolution or a bill comes up concerning Israel, the vote is something like 412 to 7 in favor of Israel. I have zero doubt that the vote to fund Israel above the $4 billion or so that we give it every year will pass overwhelmingly by a massive bipartisan consensus. The White House knows that too, and so what they want to do is ensure that when you vote for that aid package to Israel, which is going to be depicted as something of immediate urgency, it can't even wait one day, anyone who waits one day loves Hamas, all those tactics are going to be brought to bear, and so what they want to do is stick Ukraine funding in it to force House Republicans to vote yes, because if they don't, they'll be accused of the worst thing possible, which is insufficient support for Israel. House Republicans warned sharply against efforts to link support for Jerusalem and Kyiv, but some Biden officials see an advantage in doing so. Quote, no final decisions have been made on whether to link the request, said two senior administration officials who spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss private conversations. One of the officials said such a move could make sense because it, quote, jams the far right, which is firmly opposed to more Ukraine aid, but strongly supportive of aid to Israel. And at some point, I want to re-raise this question, which we've actually devoted a show to before to asking, which is how is it that an America first foreign policy that holds that the United States should not be involved in wars, should not fuel wars or fund wars unless our own national security is directly threatened, how can that America First ideology be reconciled with treating this war in Israel as our own war, as something we have to fund, as something we have to provide the weapons for when we're already depleted in our weapons because of our support for the other proxy war, the one in Ukraine? Tucker Carlson last night on his Twitter show interviewed Vivek Ramaswamy, and before he did, he gave a monologue similar to the one he used to do on his Fox show, asking exactly that question, saying, well, obviously, any psychologically healthy person who looks at videos of some of the things Hamas did in massacring civilians in Israel is going to be enraged and disgusted, which is what I started off my show on this war last night also observing. But he then asked, but how do you get from that rage and disgust to saying, well, we have to treat this war as our own? He pointed out that we give the funding for Israel's Iron Dome, even though we don't have an Iron Dome system ourselves. So I do think that's a topic to explore in the future, but this is what the Biden administration is doing, which is they know that even Republicans on the kind of anti-interventionist or anti-war side of the party. There is none on the Democratic side. Don't want to support funding for Ukraine, but have to support funding for Israel and want to support funding for Israel. Quote, top Biden administration officials have told leaders of the House and the Senate, as well as members of key committees, that the White House will soon ask Congress to approve additional military aid to Israel after Palestinian gunmen from Hamas infiltrated the country Saturday and launched the deadliest attack in Israel since the 1973 Yom Kippur War, according to two people familiar with the matter who spoke on the condition of anonymity. That request could come as early as next week, the people said. Democratic and Republican lawmakers have expressed overwhelming support for Israel since Saturday's attack and vowed that the United States would stand by one of its closest allies. That includes hard-right members of Congress who oppose continued aid to Ukraine and argue that the U.S. taxpayer dollar should not be used to fund a war thousands of miles from American borders. Obviously, they're implying there's a little bit of inconsistency between saying Ukraine is not the 51st American state, where we shouldn't be funding this war that doesn't threaten our national security on the other side of the world, and yet taking the exact opposite view when it comes to Israel. Josh Hawley is somebody who, for example, opposes the war, funding the war in Ukraine. He has from the beginning. He voted no, and yet yesterday he posted to X, quote, Israel is facing an existential threat. Any funding for Ukraine should be redirected to Israel immediately. Here is a tweet from someone who is familiar to viewers of the show. She's a trans woman, an American trans woman named Sarah Ashton Cirillo, who represents, or at some point represented, the Ukrainian military as its official English language spokesperson. She was fired for going on Twitter and expressing some incredibly deranged views. We covered a video that she got trapped in when she thought she was talking to a senior Ukrainian official. The former Prime Minister Poroshenko, who now is the deputy Prime Minister of Ukraine, but in fact was talking to Russian pranksters, and she said all sorts of things like admitting the war was a failure, the counteroffensive was failing, that morale was very low, and mostly of all, she said, essentially, the Russians are of an inferior race. They're not European. They're of the Mongol race. They're kind of this mongrel people. And we're defending superior races in Europe from these subhumans. It was really just a neo-Nazi ideology she was expressing. So she had gotten fired again, but she's still claiming to be the official representative of the Ukrainian military. And this is what she said, quote, personal view, the discussions taking place in Washington to bring together one funding bill to cover the appropriations for Ukraine and Israel simply makes sense. Which is obviously something anyone in Ukraine who favors that war would say, because she knows that's one of the ways to manipulate the Congress into doing what a lot of them don't want to do, which is continuing to fund the war in Ukraine. But the reason the Biden administration wants to link these two wars together is because it's not easy to justify why we should abandon Ukraine or not fund the war in Ukraine, but fund the war in Israel, given that they're not really wars that the United States is directly involved in. And they're going to force people, perhaps, to vote for funding for Ukraine by exploiting the war in Israel. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.